Okay, as promised, I am back with making sure you can see me because I realized after yesterday's that you couldn't see me the whole time pretty much. Sorry, that's a little embarrassing. With my St. Patty's Day get up like I promised. So, today we are going to be going over types of poetry, as in different structures of poetry. Yesterday we read a ballad. These are just some types. Some you're probably very familiar with and thought it was all poetry, others may be new to you. So first we have blank verse, not to be confused with free verse, okay? Not the same thing as free verse. Blank verse is written in a precise meter, typically iambic pentameter, but it does not rhyme, okay? Does not on purpose rhyme. So we'll get to free verse in a second, but free verse can have a rhyme in it. It doesn't have to, but it can. Blank verse purposely does not rhyme. Rhymed poetry. Rhymes. Very simple, I know. Free verse lacks consistent rhyme scheme, okay? So you don't have to stay within a scheme, a metrical pattern, or a musical form. It's just, you kind of do what you want. You're free. Epics. Lengthy narrative work of poetry, usually a hero's journey. Okay. Three things here. One, lengthy. And by lengthy, I mean if you've ever read the Iliad or the Odyssey, seen the movie Troy or heard of the Netflix show Troy, that's what it's about. It's based off of a book, but it's not technically a book. Actually, it's an epic poem, and it's like 1,000 or so pages long. It is technically, the whole thing is a poem, though, because it is about a hero's journey. At the time, poetry was big, and it is beautiful, but I think if it were written in modern day, it wouldn't be considered a poem. It would just be like an epic novel, but whatever. It's a narrative, so it's telling a story, and it's about a hero's journey. Narrative poetry is just what I said. It tells a story. So a good example of this is The Midnight Ride of Paul Revere. You've probably had to read this in a history class. It's very good if you haven't. And it tells a story as the poem is going on. A haiku is Japanese poetry. It's 3-line poetic form. The first line has 5 syllables, the second line has 7 syllables, and the third line has 5 syllables again. Very easy. You probably had to write one in 6th grade. They're fun to write. Pastoral poetry. Don't think of pastor like the guy at your church on Sundays. Think of pastor like pasture, even though it's spelled differently. Pastoral means nature, okay? So it's about natural world, rural life, landscapes. Pasture, pastoral. Think of those two words together. Same root. Okay. Then we have the sonnet, which is what we are reading today. It's used mostly by Shakespeare. It was already famous, but he kind of just took it and ran with it and has so many sonnets. Very famous. 14-line poem, typically concerning the topic of love. Doesn't have to be about love, but usually is. Elegies. This might remind you of the word eulogies. There is a reason for that, but there is a difference. So this is a poem, but it reflects upon death or loss. Traditionally, it has stages. It contains the themes of mourning, loss, and reflection. So it's like looking back on it as well as being sad. You mourn it, and then you talk about loss, and then you reflect on your life with it, whatever it was that you're losing. An ode. So often odes are about people who have passed away as well, but they're different from elegies because they don't have to be. They're just kind of a tribute. And they don't go through those 3 stages of mourning, loss, and reflection. They're just like ode to you. So if I wrote about my hero and that was my mom, that would be an ode to her if I wrote a poem about her. A limerick is a 5-line poem that consists of a single stanza, A-A-B-B-A, rhyme scheme, and whose subject is a short tale or description. Okay, so this kind of has a lot of things to be a limerick. It's very precise, has to have all these things, but they are common, and you have to tell a story in the 5 lines, which is kind of hard, especially with staying to the rhyme scheme. Lyric poetry, and you'll see often poets will end up finding these as a challenge. Like, it's fun to figure out how to create beautiful, short things. Like, a limerick is going to be harder to write than a free verse, because a free verse you can say whatever you want. And I asked that one time. I felt stupid, but in my college class I was like, why would someone even want to write like this? And they're like, because it's a challenge. It's fun for them to try to figure out how to put words in these precise measures. And I was like, makes sense. Okay, lyric poetry refers to the broad category of poetry that concerns feelings and emotion. Songs, lyrics, poetry, songs with lyrics are poetry. Ballad, another type of song, but not typically put with music, maybe some background instrumentals, but more like, it sounds more like you're singing a poem out loud than a song technically does. It can be poetic or musical. It goes both ways. Typically follows a pattern of rhymed quatrains, which a lot of songs do that as well. Okay, so like I said, we are reading a sonnet today. Sonnet structure has 14 lines, and they're kind of broken down into the pattern that it follows. So our first 8 lines is called an octave, and it introduces a problem or asks a question. Okay, that happens within the first 8 lines. And then the final 6 is called a sestet. Okay, and in those 6 lines, it will answer the question and solve the issue, Now, the 2 final lines included in the Moose, stop barking at the neighbors. The 2 final lines are included in that sestet because remember, we only have 14 lines. 8 plus 6 is 14, but they sum up the sonnet every time at the end of a sonnet. Okay, it'll end in a couplet, so it'll rhyme, and it sums up whatever you're trying to say. So, today we are reading Yvonne Bolen's Atlantis, a Lost Sonnet. Just a little background if you don't know anything about Atlantis. There was, I believe it originated with Greek mythology, but mythology dating back to BC times were it claimed that there was this lost land that once belonged to the gods, and I think it was Poseidon's kingdom, and it was underwater, but then all of the Zeus banned it. I need to brush up on my Greek mythology, but basically there's this lost kingdom called Atlantis. And it's hidden, and people try to find it. There's a wonderful Disney movie, one of my favorites growing up, called Atlantis. If you haven't seen it, go watch it. I think it's on Netflix. I use that picture here in a little bit. Again, I will link this PowerPoint below under resources, but I cannot actually play this video out loud for you. So, excuse me. So I'm just going to have to read it to you. Oh no. Okay. Wow, it linked the Google search. Whoops. Okay. Atlantis, a Lost Sonnet. This poem is by Yvonne Bolen. A couple things about her really quick. It tells us over here she was born in Dublin, Ireland in 1944. She is one of their more contemporary poets, even though that sounds like a long time ago without, it sounds like a long time ago that she was writing to us, but it really wasn't. She passed away very recently on April 27th, 2020. She is one of my favorite poets of all time. I was very saddened by her death. That she lived a long and wonderful life. And I just want to kind of show you some background. This is reflected in a lot of her poetry, and I think it has subliminal meanings in this poem as well. So if you'll look at kind of this timeline, this is Irish Wars. From 1916 through 1923, they were fighting for their independence. So it began with the Easter Rising. Then there was the War of Independence, and then there was the Civil War, where Ireland split in half and fought each other, still having to do with their independence from Britain. It was kind of like people who supported the king and people who didn't after they became their own nation still continue to fight within their own country. Really awful time. Most of Irish poetry is based off of these, although there are some of early Ireland as well, but primarily in the early 1900s. So she writes a lot about this. It affected her. Now, she was born in the 40s, but that was only 20 years after. So her parents lived through this, and it sounds like a long time, but it's really not that long after a war goes through your country. Okay, so if you can think, 9/11 is one of the closest things we've had to a war on our homeland here in America. We've had various terrorist attacks, but that was the worst, right? And that was in 2001. We are exactly 20 years later, 2021, and we still talk about 9/11. We still honor it. There are songs written about it. There are poems. There are books. There are movies. We still talk about and remember 9/11. And that was one event. When your country goes through a war on your homeland for almost 10 years, you're going to talk about that 20 years later. Like that's a long war, okay? And it's sad. And it caused, they had the famine going on then. They were starving. It was a very, very rough time. And they were learning how to be their own country on top of it. It was a lot of stress, and she was kind of born into all of this. So even though she was not born yet, it was not lost on her, because everyone still lived as if the war had just happened. Okay, so then they had, again, campaigns against Northern Ireland. The Irish Republican campaign was so it was like South versus North. Really the exact same as the Revolutionary period, because it was divided up just like the American Revolution. The Civil War. But they, because these two fell right after the Civil War, it was still kind of divided even though the war was over. And just not good at all. So she lived through quite a few historic battles and wars as well. So that influenced a ton of her writing. Now, okay, just one second. Sorry, I had to make sure I was still recording. Okay, so now we are going to read, not that, because that is the Song of the Wandering Aengus. We're going to read Atlantis, a lost sonnet. So you have the background on what Atlantis is and who Yvonne Bolland is. How on earth did it happen? I used to wonder that a whole city, arches, pillars, colonnades, not to mention vehicles and animals, had all one fine day gone under. I said to myself, the world was small then. Surely a great city must have been missed. I miss our old city. White pepper, white pudding, you and I meet under fanlights and low skies to go home in it. Maybe what really happened is this. The old fable makers searched hard for a word to convey that what is gone forever, and never found it. And so, in the best traditions of where we come from, they gave their sorrows a name and drowned it. Okay, let's break it down. Beautiful poem. Okay, so she's starting out talking about Atlantis. Obviously, it's in the title. We know that. Remember, we're twisting. But first, we're just going to kind of go through, see what it's about. How on earth did it happen? I used to wonder. So she's talking about Atlantis. How did a whole city go underwater? That makes no sense. Maybe it's because the world was smaller. But when people miss a great city, that's what she says. And then she stops talking about Atlantis and switches to her point of view. I miss our old city. She's talking about Ireland, right? She misses what it used to be, because this is surely doesn't say the year she wrote this, but it was probably during, if I had to guess, let's see. She was born here. It was probably during the border campaign, or the Troubles, either one. But she's like, I miss how it used to be. White pepper, white pudding, those are traditional things for them, cultural, so that's where that comes from. You and I meeting under fanlights and low skies to go home in it. Maybe what really happened is the old fable makers, the people who tell stories, search hard for a word to convey that what is gone forever and never found. Okay, so she's saying maybe it's not a true story. Maybe that was just their way of trying to teach us a lesson to say, when you lose it, you lose it. It's gone forever. It's not coming back. In the best traditions of where we come, they gave their sorrow a name and drowned it. So she's like heavily referring to Ireland here, and she's like, so just like we always do, we're just going to name it and forget it ever happened. We're going to drown our sorrows, okay? A lot of people say if you drown your sorrows, you use it with a vice, okay? You drown your sorrows in a bottle of liquor, maybe. Basically, you distract yourself, forget that your problems are happening, okay? You mourn it, and then you move on, but you distract yourself from the pain of what has happened. So she's referring to her homeland here. And also, Ireland is a big drinking country. They're known for their whiskey and their beer, and really just for being heavy drinkers. So again, drowning her sorrows is kind of relating to that. And she's like, that's what we do. So maybe they knew that's what they did. And obviously that is a play on words there, because Atlantis is drowned because it's underwater. Genius. I love her. I love this poem. It's short, sweet, and simple. So if we go back to what a sonnet includes, it includes an octave that introduces a problem or asks a question, a sestet, which answers the question, and then the turn. Okay, so in our first 8 lines, let's see, we've got it here. Here is the question we have to ask. What is our problem or question? Okay, 8 lines. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Oh, they did not. So this is poets.org. They did not put it in the lines that it is supposed to go in. That's not good, because poetry is meant to be read like that. But it's going to be these right here. 1, 2, nope. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. Yeah, they made it 15 lines. Good job. Okay. How on earth did it happen? I used to wonder that a whole city, not to mention vehicles and animals, had all one day gone under. Okay, so there's our question. How did an entire city vanish, right? And also, we have a problem. She misses her old city. Okay, so those are our 2 things. How is it resolved in the end of the poem? How do they resolve it? By drowning their sorrows. And she kind of resolves this question of, well, how did that happen? She says, well, maybe it wasn't true. Maybe it was a metaphor for the way that we deal with our pain. So that's how she resolves in her mind a whole city sinking to the bottom of the ocean. And how she resolves missing her home, she says people resolve by drowning their sorrows. And then in our last 2 lines, the turn, it's not always a turn like a plot twist, but it's how did they sum up. And that's the metaphor she throws in there, which is wonderful. These 2 would be the last 2 lines that would start with in. So she ties it back again to her home and the way that they deal with things, and also made it a play on words with how Atlantis is, because it's underwater. So beautiful, beautiful ending. Sonnets always have great endings. That's the point of them. They've got to sum it up perfectly, or it's just really not a good sonnet. Oh no, wrong page. Okay, so